Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to our sponsors, Miller Thompson, Primetime Sports Entertainment, and Porter Airlines, as well as Dickinson Wright. The winners of this get a round, I guess you guys already know, a round-trip flight courtesy of Porter Airlines, as well as 2 tickets to the Primetime Sports Entertainment Conference in November. And that will be presented at the end. Also, we have a raffle for lead tickets courtesy of Dickinson Wright, which we'll be doing at the end of the final panel. So we'll let the bailiff take over. It's Johnny again.
Alright, so this arbitration hearing is for New York Rangers forward Derek Brassard, and the midpoint salary is $5 million. The judges for this arbitration hearing, first to my right, is Mr. Hart, Mr. Don Meehan, and Mr. Brian Burke. The 2 teams competing, representing the player is Team 29, and representing the club is Team 16. Let's go over the oral argument rules for this hearing. Oral arguments may only reference information about the player that is available on the date that the player's salary was decided during the summer of 2014. In other words, after the player's salary was decided, anything that happens to that player is inadmissible. As well, teams may not introduce information about hockey in general after the cases were released to them. So for example, a possible comparable who was signed after the date the cases were released cannot be used. An opposing team should object to the arbitrators immediately should the team introduce impressible evidence. The arbitrators may impose penalties at their own discretion. This hearing will last 36 minutes in length. Each team has a total allotted time of 18 minutes each. Both teams must begin their opening remarks by requesting rebuttal time to be reserved. The hearing will proceed as follows. The player side goes first. They have 18 minutes minus their requested rebuttal time. Then the club side goes. They have 18 minutes minus their requested rebuttal time. Then the player side gets their rebuttal, and then the club side gets their rebuttal. The aforementioned time restraints are inclusive of any questions posed by the arbitrators. Teams may ask for additional time to respond to a question. This must be asked prior to the expiration of their current time allotment. The arbitrators, at their own discretion, may grant such a request. And the team members may divide the time as they wish. For your guys' reference, when you guys hit the 5-minute mark, I'll raise a 5-minute sign. When you guys hit the 1-minute mark, I'll raise a 1-minute sign. And when you guys hit your time, I'll raise my hand. On your opening, if you go over time, even if I raise my hand, you don't just stop. That time will just be deducted from your rebuttal time. Again, if you don't use all your time, that will be added to your rebuttal time.
We're going to reserve 4 minutes for
When you're ready.
So before we start, maybe you gentlemen can stand up and introduce yourselves to the rest of the audience.
Tyler Henderson, I'm representing U of T.
Fraser Malcolm, also me.
Devon McIntyre from the University of Western Ontario.
I'm Sean Giallo from Western University as well. I'd like to begin by thanking our esteemed arbitrators for coming here today and agreeing to listen to our case and also opposing counsel as well. My name is Tyler Henderson. This is my colleague Fraser Malcolm, and today we will make the case to you that the appropriate award for Mr. Brassard is below the specified midpoint figure of $5 million above. To which we contend that $5.1 million is both fair and reflective of his value as a player. And our opening arguments will proceed in 2 parts. The first part, which I will be covering, will discuss Mr. Brassard and his individual merits. First, his remarkable consistency as a points producer. Second, his exceptional physicality as a center. Third, his impressive durability. Fourth, his outstanding playoff track record. And fifth, his unique and highly valuable blend of the first 3 points: consistency, physicality, and durability, all in one package. For the second part of our arguments, my colleague will then go on to compare how we've arrived at the $5.1 million mark in relation to other players, and we will then use the rebuttal time to address any criticisms or concerns at that point. So to begin with, Mr. Brassard is a 6'1", 190-pound center for the New York Rangers. Originally drafted 6th overall by Columbus in 2006 as a dual-threat forward that could score and assert a physical presence on the ice. We believe for the reasons that follow, he has certainly lived up to these expectations. First, Mr. Brassard's remarkable consistency. In every single season over the past 4 years, Mr. Brassard has put up at least .55 points per game. During your time, respectively, hearing our hockey arbitrations on either side, you have no doubt been acquainted with arguments relying on outliers and statistical anomalies, but with Mr. Brassard, you know what you're going to get, and we believe that there's a premium to the certainty. What's more, he's even shown signs of improvement as a player. During his platform year, where he played in 81 games, he set a career high in total goals. Further, during his platform year, he also demonstrated significant improvement in his power play ability, serving as an effective weapon for the Rangers in his capacity by scoring a career high in power play goals, 7, and total power play points, 18. The second point is Mr. Brassard's exceptional physicality. Once again, we see this consistency repeating itself as he's registered over 1.5 hits per game in each season over the last 4 seasons. This aggressiveness was further demonstrated during his platform year when he put up 46 penalty minutes, top 5 amongst New York forwards. We believe this highly physical play created scoring opportunities and protection for his teammates as the New York Rangers advanced all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. Third, Mr. Brassard has impressive durability. In spite of the highly physical nature of his game and fearlessness on the ice, Mr. Brassard has remained remarkably healthy. Simply put, reports of Mr. Brassard as an injury risk have been greatly exaggerated. While he did experience a shoulder injury during 2008, this was sustained during a fight and not due to any natural frailty that might have detrimental effects on his playing time moving forward. And we contend here that the real concern with injuries is what they portend in the future, whether he's liable to be injured and thus miss playing time. But we do have a 4-season sample size that testifies to the opposite. Since his injury in 2008, he's appeared in 94% of his games while maintaining what we believe very significant and consistent offensive performance. While opposing counsel will no doubt turn to his past injuries as a way of devaluing him, the facts bear points out in this regard. Our fourth point is that Mr. Brassard has an outstanding playoff track record. He's played in 35 playoff games, and we don't think this is a small sample size to sniff at. And in those games, he has registered 0.69 points per game. This is extraordinary production. Empirically, anyone who's watched hockey knows that the pace of the game quickens during the playoffs. Many are unable to meet the heightened speed and the pressures that come along with this territory, and many players have folded under pressure, it must be said. Mr. Brassard, on the other hand, has more than risen to the occasion with outstanding playoff performance, particularly during his platform year, where he notched 6 goals, 6 assists, and had a plus-minus of +4. And the last point I would like to make is that he has a very unique combination of the first 3 points. Considered holistically, Mr. Brassard's rare blend of point production, physicality, and durability put him in very esteemed company. And here I would like to refer you to page 3 of the brief that we've submitted. And I would like to preempt any questions also by saying that we don't contend here that he should be paid on par with Mr. Ovechkin by any means. We merely want to assert at this point that there is a premium on a player who can combine all of these factors together. Points production, showing up for many games, and demonstrating a high physical presence on the ice. Every player that you see there has over 0.55 points per game over the past 4 seasons, 1.5 hits per game over the past 4 seasons, and have made 94% of their total game, also over the past 4 seasons. We believe in conclusion that Mr. Brassard is truly a unique case in the sense that he's a very versatile player. You know what you're going to get when you put him on the ice. You know what you're going to get when you sign him. He is consistent, he puts up points, and he's a highly offensive center. And I would like to give the floor to my colleague at this point in order to tell you how we arrived at the appropriate award amount.
Great. Thank you. I'm Fraser Malcolm, and as Tyler said, I'll be discussing how we arrived at a figure above the midpoint salary, specifically $5.1 million. I'll do this in 3 parts. First, I'll outline the filters that we used to get to arrive at the 2 comparable players that we deem are appropriate, Blake Wheeler and Brian Little. Second, I'll outline Mr. Brassard's career and platform year performance in comparison to Mr. Little and Mr. Wheeler. And finally, I'll highlight our conclusion, which is that Mr. Brassard should be awarded a salary higher than Mr. Little's and lower than Mr. Wheeler's, and we contend that $5.1 million is that appropriate award. If you look at the exhibit that we have, it outlines the filters that we used. First, we applied a career to platform games filter of plus or minus 1 full season, 82 games, to ensure that we're getting players at a similar point in their career who had an opportunity to establish themselves in the NHL, as Mr. Brassard has. Second, looking at career to platform points per game, looking at people within 10%, looking at players within 10% on that range. Again, as we talked about, Mr. Brassard is a consistent player, so we think that over the course of a career, in order to get appropriate comparable players, they have to be players who have consistently produced over that time, and we think that's an appropriate range. And finally, looking at platform season points per game, only players that have reported more than half a point per game in their platform season. In talking about offensive production, making sure that we're comparing him to other players who produce at that rate. As far as comparable salaries go, we contend that Mr. Wheeler's comparable salary is $4.7 million, and Mr. Wheeler's is 5.6. And just for your information, that both players had platform seasons in 2012-2013. which was the lockout shortened season. Turning first to comparing Mr. Broussard to Mr. Little, and I'll be highlighting the points that are available on your exhibit there. Looking first at points per game and goals per game, they are comparable offensive producers. Mr. Broussard recorded slightly fewer points per game, but he did record more goals per game. And then when it comes to the power play, he vastly outperformed Mr. Little, 27 power play goals versus 2 for Mr. Little, with comparable time on ice. Looking then at the physicality of their games, this is an aspect of the game that Mr. Little just simply does not bring. If you can see by his hits, 32 hits in the platform season, almost a hit per game fewer than Mr. Broussard. So when you're talking about what they bring to the team, Mr. Broussard brings that. So when you look at their performance platform year in that regard, on the whole, I think that Mr. Broussard is slightly better than Mr. Little. When you turn to their playoff productions over their careers and their platform season, the contrast becomes more stark.
I just want to ask you a question. For me to understand the platform year, the career platform year comparisons, I have to flip between your brief and the exhibit, right? Your brief seems to set out actual statistics, goals per game, and then I have to.
Yeah, we've narrowed it down to the relative, just because it is the platform season is a 48-game season, so this is the comparative.
But the points per game are on your exhibit, they're not in the brief. That correct?
Yes, you have my copy of that. Turning to platform performance, the stark contrast between Mr. Broussard and Mr. Little is clear. Mr. Little did not qualify for the playoffs in his platform season, and he's in fact never played a career playoff game in the NHL, whereas Mr. Broussard has played a total of 35 career games and has in fact increased his performance points per game greatly once he gets into the playoffs.
I assume that's due to club failure, not players' failure. If you were arguing for Mr. Little, you'd point out that management had not given him an opportunity to play in a playoff game, wouldn't you?
Yes, it's true Mr. Little has played for the Thrashers and the Winnipeg Jets, who are more often contending to not be the worst team in the league, as opposed to Mr. Broussard, who are contending to be a Stanley Cup champion in his platform season. They made the Stanley Cup Finals. I think it also makes a point that when you're looking at their statistics in the regular season, that what Mr. Broussard, the games he's playing in are more meaningful. Mr. Little's often been, either statistically or in real terms, eliminated from the playoffs fairly early on in the season. That I think devalues his platform or his regular season performance as well. So that's another point. So for all of these reasons, we contend that Mr. Broussard is a superior player to Mr. Little, and as such should be awarded a higher salary than $4.7 million. Turning next to Mr. Wheeler, if you look at Mr. Wheeler's career platform points per game, they are comparable to Mr. Broussard's. We acknowledge that Mr. Wheeler stepped up in his platform season and recorded 0.85 points per game and 0.4 goals per game, sort of defining himself in his role now as a pure goal scorer. But we contend that over the course of their career they have had similar outputs. Again, Mr. Wheeler, similar to Mr. Little, comparable time on the ice, but far inferior to Mr. Broussard when it comes to power play goals. Hits, again, Mr. Broussard is a very physical player. Mr. Wheeler also brings that aspect. We're not arguing that Mr. Broussard is at Mr. Wheeler's level. We're arguing that he's in that same range and is thus an appropriate comparable. Again, the playoff production stands heavily in favor of Mr. Broussard again. Platform year, one player's team didn't make the playoffs. Granted, Mr. Burke may have been given a poor team by management, but in this regard, Broussard was able to be on a better team and perform his role and allow them to make the playoffs and then succeed once they arrived there. And if you look at their career performance in the playoffs, Mr. Broussard has stepped up, whereas Mr. Wheeler's career playoff points per game is lower than his regular season. Again, if he does ever make the playoffs again, that portends that he's not likely to do as well. So for that reason, although the playoff production for Mr. Broussard is superior, obviously the platform production for Mr. Wheeler is strong, and so we think that Mr. Broussard falls in just below Mr. Wheeler, and therefore we've proposed to you a salary that falls slightly below the midpoint between Mr. Wheeler and Mr. Little at $5.1 million above the midpoint. Unless there are any questions.
So Mr. Little, who played on these terrible teams, was -5 for his career performance same exact games played as Mr. Broussard, who's minus 37. But he was playing on a terrible team in meaningless games. How do you explain that?
If Mr. Broussard over his career started with the Blue Jackets, and the time when he was there, his platform or his plus minus was poor. But as he's gone on to a competitive team and he's been on the Rangers, been a positive player in both seasons he's been with the Rangers.
I have a question about your search criteria.
Okay.
So you use plus or minus 82 games for someone who's played over 400 games.
Yeah.
For a career platform, you use plus or minus 10%.
Yes.
But why did you not use the same filter or bookends for platform season? Because if I look at both of your comps, their platform season, they're more than 10% difference to the players.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I don't disagree with the math. They are outside the 10% when if it comes to the platform season. We just think, and part of our submission has been that Mr. Broussard is a consistent player who's brought that and should be compensated based on his career. Platform season is important, but it's not the entire picture. And so if you look at their career to platform production, they are comparable players. If you look at that, they are in the platform season, like I said, Mr. Wheeler had a spike, but that is an outlier if you look at compared to the career to platform where they're more
Which should be more important to us, the platform year or career to platform?
I think that they're both important, but we're arguing that one of Mr. Broussard's strengths is his consistency, and you can't determine a consistency based on one season. And so, in order to keep consistency as a relevant consideration, and we contend that it is, you need to look beyond just the one season.
You talked about the rare brand of physicality on behalf of the player. How does his position relate to the rest of his team or the rest of the league?
As far as hits per game, I don't have the exact rank of him in hits in relation to the rest of the league.
Just to add to that, I would assume that if we are making that assessment over a 4-year period, then it would have been caught by the exhibit that we've given you there. And I don't believe, granted that I don't have it offhand, that any of his teammates do appear on that.
Yeah, and part of the physicality is that in each of those seasons, they had more than 1.5 hits. It wasn't over the 4 seasons, it was in each of those seasons. And in each of those seasons, they had over half a point per game. And in each of those seasons, they played more than 94% of the games. So when we're talking about as an elite, bringing an elite blend of those 3 attributes, that's how he arrives on that list with such a elite company.
Do you have any comments in relation to the UFA years as opposed to restricted?
Yeah, I mean, we're here arguing about a midpoint salary of $5 million that's determined based on an AAV, and so we used AAVs as part of in order to compare apples to apples, and that's how we arrived at the numbers we used.
Well, picking up on that, do you know the length of Mr. Little's contract?
Just 1 second here. Mr. Little's is 5 years, $23.5 million, and Mr. Wheeler's is 6 years, $33.6 million.
And what's the impact, if any, of the salary arbitration for a 1-year contract? Assess
We understand that longer contracts are less persuasive, but we think when you're looking at comparable players, that these are comparable players. And a UFA year versus a non-UFA year is a consideration. At the same time, when a player is agreeing to a long-term deal, there's a certain amount of stability in that, and so that also gets factored into what the ultimate salary is. And so it's not necessarily only one factor that arrives at the breakdown in the years and the overall value. Okay. Thank you.
All right, I believe we're going to be reserving 3 minutes for our rebuttal period. Okay, we all good to go. Perfect. All right, good afternoon, arbitrators. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Devon McIntyre. This is my co-counsel, Sean Giallo. We'll be representing the club, the New York Rangers, in this arbitration between the Rangers and Derek Broussard. After assessing Mr. Broussard based on his individual accomplishments and contributions to the Rangers, the club respectfully requests that the panel find he is entitled to a salary arbitration award of $4.1 million. Now, as you're well aware, the CBA lists the following as types of evidence that may be offered in a salary arbitration hearing. The overall performance of the player, both offensively and defensively in the previous seasons, the number of games played by the player and his injuries in preceding seasons, the length of service of the player in the league and with the club, the overall contribution of the player to the success of his club in the preceding season, any special qualities of leadership or public appeal, as well as the overall performance and compensation of comparable players. So I'll be discussing the first 5 evidentiary criteria, and my colleague Sean will discuss the comparable players portion. So if you'll turn to Exhibit A, you'll see that in 2008 and 2009, Mr. Brassard's first season in the NHL, as a full-time NHLer, he was scoring at an impressive .81 points per game pace. However, this only lasted for 31 games. He lost the rest of that season to injury. That pace has since gone unmatched through the rest of his NHL career, and his scoring pace has slowed, averaging down to .61 points per game for his career. Now, we acknowledge that Mr. Brassard is an offensively talented player and effective on the power play. However, he's largely ineffective defensively, and his role as a physical defensive forward has been overstated. His utilization, his use specifically, is what we look to show why Mr. Brassard is not really a defensive forward. If you'll see in Exhibit E, his shorthanded time on ice per game in his platform year was a single second, and his career shorthanded time on ice was 5 seconds. For a forward that may serve in a third-line checking role, he's demonstrated remarkably little ability to be relied on in defensive situations, and thus hasn't seen time on the penalty kill. Also, his career time on ice is only his career time on ice is less than 15 minutes, 14:51, and his platform year was only 15 minutes and 47 seconds. So, showing again that his usage has been limited throughout his entire career. You'll notice that his highest career time on ice was 17 minutes, which he had in the 2010 and 11 season, and that amount of use has gone unmatched since. So you might think that perhaps the lower offensive statistics are a result of that time on ice. However, Brassard has still played almost a minute more in his platform career, or his platform year, over his career average. As well, Brassard averaged 2.5 minutes on the power play in his career season. So, considering the Rangers' depth, it's unlikely that he would be given more time on ice per game. Mr. Brassard ranked 8th among forwards in 2012 and 13, and 7th among Rangers forwards in 2013-14 in average time on ice per game. In addition to that, the Rangers themselves ranked 18th in the league for goals for in 2013-14, showing that Brassard's offensive role was with a team who already performed below average offensively, and that he was not used anymore for his offensive abilities. Now, the club would submit that our colleagues for the player have slightly overstated Mr. Brassard's physical characteristics. They describe him as a physical player and rely largely on hits, but Brassard was playing on the third line. He was a checking center for the New York Rangers. The hits are a result of simply the schemes that he was probably intended to use as a third-line checking center.
Probably.
I suppose that's speculative, but he was a third-line checking center for the New York Rangers, as is evidenced by his line mates and his even-strength time on ice. If you look at a more traditional stat that is indicative of physicality, his penalty minutes, Mr. Brassard has never recorded more than 50 penalty minutes in a season. Looking at the penalties that he took, also, in his platform season, 6 of his minors were for tripping, 3 were for hooking, 3 were from slashing, stick infractions. Not a trait or hallmarks of a physical forward. He had 0 fights, 0 roughing penalties, 0 boarding penalties, and 0 charging penalties in his career, in his platform season.
No truculence.
No. Definite lack of truculence. That's what we're saying. As far as Mr. Brassard's playoff performance, we believe that that's also being slightly overstated. Although his career playoff numbers seem reasonably high, if you look at the most recent playoffs, he recorded slightly below his career points per game in an extended playoff run, recording 12 points in 23 games. His career numbers are inflated by the year before, in which he scored 12 goals or 12 points, sorry, in 12 playoff games. And this was, again, coming off of a lockout-shortened season. Also, the notion of Mr. Brassard as a consistent producer is slightly at odds with the notion of Mr. Brassard as an improving offensive forward. So, the club acknowledges that he has been fairly consistent in terms of point production. His platform season, even .56, not that far below his .63 points per game career. However, the notion that his career high 18 goals in his platform season is a sign that he's on the up and up. It's only 1 goal more than the 17 he had 4 seasons prior. So the idea that Mr. Brassard is improving and should be expected to score at a greater rate in the future is speculative and somewhat inaccurate. Now I'll hand over to my colleague, Mr. Giallo, unless are there any questions? Okay.
As my colleague Devon McIntyre mentioned, my name is Sean Giallo, and I'll now be discussing the comparable players the club submits for 26-year-old Derek Brassard. Now the club has chosen comparable players who are forwards, eligible for salary arbitration within the past 2 years, who are similar in age, games played, and who have been relied on primarily in an offensive role similar to Derek Brassard. So our first comparable...
What does that mean? Relied on from an offensive role.
Well, if you turn to Exhibit E of the club exhibits, you'll notice that both throughout his career and in his platform year, Derek Brassard has averaged almost no time on the penalty kill, but he receives quite a bit of time for power play time on ice. So in finding comparables, we've looked for players who play the majority of their special team's time on ice on the power play, not so much shorthanded, and also similar time on ice per game.
Did you not use your friends used points per game as a filter? Did you not look at that when you were looking for your
We looked for that, absolutely. But we felt that when controlling for the factors listed on Exhibit B of the club's exhibit paper right here, you'll notice that you're never going to find 2 players who are exactly the same. Even twins, Daniel and Henrik Sedin, have different career point totals, different things affect them. And so when controlling for that factors, it's easier to assess the differences, or the slight differences in point per game totals and the other stats that are relevant in terms of the criteria laid out in the CBA. So again, looking at Brian Little, looking at Exhibit C and D of the club exhibits page, you'll notice that Little has the advantage in terms of career highs in goals and points, 31 and 51. Both players' offensive statistics have hit plateaus in recent years. However, Little has already surpassed 20 goals in a single season, twice in the 6-season career. Little has the advantage in points per game in his platform year, but has slightly less points per game over the course of his career. Additionally, Little had a slow shot percentage with a 4.8% in his platform year, which is almost 8% less than his career average of 12%, suggesting that his goal totals should rise. He isn't likely to repeat a 7-goal shortened season. So in terms of the other criteria relevant to the comparable players, since entering the league, Little's played a total of 88% of all eligible games, in comparison to Brassard's 73%. Additionally, most of Little's games lost were due to splitting time between the AHL and NHL in his rookie season. So in conclusion, in the summer of 2013 for Little, the Jets signed him to a 5-year contract with an average annual value of $4.7 million. However, on a contract of this length, many additional variables are considered, such as the player's potential, the number of unrestricted free agency years included in that long-term contract.
How many years in that case?
I think he had 3 years. Yep, 3 years.
And so what's the impact of that to us?
Well, if you look at the breakdown of Little's contract, in the first year of his contract he's paid $4 million, and in the final 2 years he's paid $5 million in each of those years. And so it's clear that the club intended to control for the fact that Little would have been an unrestricted free agent in those latter years of his contract. So in looking at that, the club feels that Brian Little's actual salary in the year following his arbitration eligibility is a better metric in terms of assessing Derek Brassard's arbitration award by comparison to the comparable players. So Brian Little's had a $4 million actual salary in the 2013-2014 season, and considering Little's been a superior player, but on a less successful team in almost all categories, we request that Mr. Brassard receive a salary arbitration award similar to Brian Little's $4 million actual salary. Our second,
Let me interrupt you. The structure, the way teams structure that, even when they're buying UFA years, is often tied to other players on their team. I don't think that means at all the club felt he was worth $4 million in year one of that contract. They do that weighting internally. I would answer it's a nice try, but I don't think it's a realistic value. It said just that year, this is what he's worth. We struck the club structure the way they want to.
that's true. That's a fair assessment, but we're looking at a 1-year contract here for Derek Brassard, so in trying to compare that to a 5-year contract.
That's right, then use the AAV, because that's what we would do in any other circumstance.
Okay. So moving on to Sam Gagne then, even his AAV is lower at 4.7 million, and if you look at Brian Little's point production in exhibits C and D, there's still Little outscored Brassard in his platform year, and he had only slightly less points per game totals over his entire career. In addition, Little's played almost a minute of time on ice per game in short-handed minutes. So moving on to Sam Gagne, our second comparable, 24-year-old with the Edmonton Oilers. Gagne is younger than Mr. Brassard, although both players were drafted 6th overall. They have strong similarities in the role they play for their respective teams, and have similar career games played and career performance statistics. Now, the career points per game and games played for Gagne and Mr. Brassard are nearly identical. However, Gagne demonstrated much more potential in his platform year, scoring at a rate of .79 points per game in comparison to Mr. Brassard's .56. Gagne has been used by the Oilers in a more extensive role in addition, averaging nearly 4 more minutes of time on ice per game in his platform year. He also plays more time on both penalty kill and power play, both career-wise and in his platform year. In addition to the public appeal Sam Gagne offers to Edmonton and their fans in terms of being tied for the club record for most points in a single game with 8, with Wayne Gretzky, and most points in a single period with 5, Gagne has the edge over Brassard in terms of public appeal with Edmonton and their fans. Gagne and Brassard both have similar injury histories, but overall Gagne has missed less time to injuries. So Gagne's 3-year contract is worth an average annual value of $4.8 million and an actual salary of $4.4 million in 2013-2014. The club requests that Mr. Brassard receive a salary arbitration award slightly lower than Gagne's actual salary for the 13-14 season. Our final comparable is Blake Wheeler, 26-year-old for the Winnipeg Jets. Similarities in age, games played, and his career statistics make him a suitable comparable. So Wheeler has the statistical advantage both in terms of career performance and in his platform year. Mr. Brassard and Wheeler are both used in similar roles for their respective teams, playing on the power play but receiving limited time on the penalty kill. Therefore, we need to analyze these players' statistics in terms of primarily their offensive contributions. Throughout his career, Wheeler scored an identical point per game average to Mr. Brassard. However, Wheeler scored more goals and has a higher shooting percentage both over the course of his career and in his platform year. In a single season, Wheeler has a better career high in points with 64 and goals with 21. Wheeler sets a career high in goals and point per game average in his platform year as well, scoring more goals than Brassard and 4 less points in 33 fewer games. Wheeler also has a higher average career time on ice than Brassard, suggesting he plays a more crucial role in the success or failure of the Jets than Brassard does for the Rangers. Additionally, Wheeler's only missed 2 games to injury since entering the NHL. For these reasons, Wheeler has the advantage over Brassard in terms of his injury history. Wheeler signed a 6-year contract with the Jets in 2013 worth an average annual value of $5.6 million and an actual salary of $4.6 million in 2013-2014. Since Wheeler is superior to Mr. Brassard in nearly every statistical category set out in Article 12 of the CBA, The club respectfully requests that the player receive a salary lower than Wheeler's salary, both in AAV and for his actual salary in the year following his arbitration eligibility. So in conclusion, the club submits that Derek Broussard receive a salary arbitration award below Blake Wheeler's and Sam Donnie's actual salary after their platform years, but slightly more than Brian Little's actual salary in 2013-14. We respectfully request that the panel find that Derek Broussard is entitled to a salary arbitration award of $4.1 million. Are there any questions?
No, I just raised the same objection or note that I raised earlier, which would be I think you're mistakenly relying on the first year of a multi-year award as significant in terms of value, when in fact the AAV carries far more weight in my mind.
Tell me a little bit more about your rationale for the figure that you're requesting of 4.1, given consideration of the midpoint. Tell me about your strategy in terms of coming to us as arbitrators and how you arrived at number 4.1.
Well, we tried to assess his salary figure by comparison to the comparable players. So if you look at Exhibit B, we're looking at actual salary because many of these long-term contracts stretch into many of the UFA years. And while AAV may be a more persuasive salary figure to consider, a 5- and 6-year deal, clubs paying for up to 4 years of unrestricted free agent eligibility. Now, when the player is a restricted free agent, he's much more limited in his ability to negotiate with other teams, and I think clubs take that into consideration when buying up these unrestricted free agency years.
They do. There's a premium on those years. How the deals are structured, I can tell you, we just had one with a player just came out and signed a big deal, including some UFA years. The reason the salary was what it was in year one is to make sure that he wasn't paid more than a certain important player on our team. That's it. It wasn't based on how do we value these years. Do we assign a certain weight to the UFA years versus the RFA years? We don't. So it's an innovative approach. I'm not offended by the approach. I'm not swayed by it in the least.
Okay. Well, in terms of that, we feel that all three players have performed comparably in terms of their offensive statistics. But if you look to Exhibit E, all three players have also played more time on ice shorthanded, suggesting that the time they do play for their teams isn't solely in an offensive role. So while they're being put in more of a two-way role, they're still scoring at a comparable rate to Mr. Broussard. So if you take that into consideration, we feel that Mr. Broussard deserves a salary arbitration award lower than all three of the comparables' average annual value. Any additional questions? Thank you very much.
All right, so Claire said you have 2 minutes for rebuttal.
Mr. Arbitrators, 3 quick points on my end, and then I'll give the floor to my colleague. The first of which is on procedural grounds. Mr. Hart, you mentioned earlier that our parameters might have some issues involved with them, but I would like to raise the fact that we did put parameters in our briefs, and it is an established convention during arbitration that both sides do that. The comparables that were offered were similar age, games played, an offensive role, and we feel that these are broad categories, and that don't open them to the same criticism that we had, because we believe that we are doing this in very good faith, respectfully. The second point that I would like to make has to do with injuries. It was mentioned before that he did sustain a substantial injury, and that made up the bulk of that 73% figure over the course of the 2008-2009 season until the current one. He sustained this during a fight, and I would like to raise again the primary worry that comes with an injury is whether or not it will be repeated, but we have enough data that shows that there has been no deleterious effects over the next 4 seasons. And once again, it was said that between the year before his platform year and his platform year, he performed to a lesser extent. The particular diction used in the submission by the opposing team was he regressed, and I would like to take issue with the term regression to the mean, because the mean that Mr. Broussard provides is excellent, and he provides that mean year in and year out, and I humbly submit that many people around the league would like to have this mean on the ice.
Should it make any difference to us how we got hurt? You mentioned he got hurt in a fight, but as an arbitrator, should it make any difference to us how he got hurt in determining how much he's played?
Sure. I think that if he was particularly reckless and he was known for these sorts of things, then that would certainly be a concern. But his track record following the fight shows that that is not the case. Additionally, I would submit that certain exigencies during the game might mean someone has to fight. We don't know the particular context of what happened to him, so he might have been put into a position where he simply had to step up.
May have.
May have.
I'll just make two brief points. First, on the time on ice, I don't think the time on ice is necessarily indicative of his performance. He plays in a better team. The three comparables that have been put forward by my opponents are teams that struggle to compete at all. I mean, Winnipeg and Edmonton have made the playoffs, and so there isn't that same depth of roster to compete with.
Where do the players rank respectively on the clubs and ice time in terms of their depth charts? So first line, second line, third line.
Mr. Broussard is on the third line, whereas the other three are all in the top two lines. With regards to ultimately what we're talking about here, the two teams, regardless of how we got at them, have come to you with two comparable players that are the same, Mr. Wheeler and Mr. Liu. We both have argued that Mr. Broussard should be awarded a salary below Mr. Wheeler. We both have argued that Mr. Broussard should be awarded a salary above Mr. Little. And that's the submission we made, and for that reason, we think that the 5.1 is an appropriate award, which is above the midpoint salary of 5. Thank you.
Alright, just now you did go 34 seconds over, so I'll take 34 seconds, we'll add it on to the rebuttal. So you have 2 minutes and 4 seconds.
All right, I'd just like to quickly reiterate one of the comments that we made a little bit in our oral submissions about Mr. Broussard's physical and defensive play. Again, like you said, Mr. Broussard is not an elite physical forward. He had 0 fights last year, and at 6'1", 190 pounds, he's not particularly imposing as far as NHL forwards go. The fact that his longest career and season-ending injury came as a result of a fight is affected his play. He simply isn't as gritty a forward as he's being billed as. Sean?
We just want to mention something in terms of the time on ice for Mr. Broussard. Mr. Broussard was traded to the New York Rangers in the 2012-2013 season. Prior to that, he played for the Columbus Blue Jackets, another team that has struggled to make the playoffs when he was a part of the club. So, in that time, he still wasn't able to massively outscore the comparable players, Brian Little, Blake Wheeler, or Sam Gagner. And we just want to mention that he was given more time on ice in that time, but once he came to the New York Rangers in the 2012-2013 season, he had more average time on ice that season than he did in the prior year and a half with the Columbus Blue Jackets. So that's all we have for the club side. Thank you.